As people, we often think that bigger is better, that the grass is greener on the other side, and that the next best thing is just around the corner. College presidents and athletic directors are not immune to this line of thinking, but it doesn't always work out in their favor, even when it probably should. This is what you don't know about college conference realignment. Welcome to What You Don't Know About Sports, where we delve into the forgotten stories, teams, and athletes of sports history and question widely held takes on today's sports. I'm Matt, and this is Blake.
Hi, everyone.
And today we have what we thought would be a hot-button topic given recent happenings in the sports world. But that was before everybody and their brother decided they needed a new coaching job in college football. But it's still a hot button topic. It's still something that's on everybody's mind, and that is conference realignment inside the NCAA. Blake, are you a fan of realignment in general?
I don't want to say no, because change is sometimes necessary, right? Things can sometimes get stale, and for one reason or another, people might need to leave, new people might need to come. But at some point, what's the real reason you're leaving, right? I believe if I had to guess, the most hot button topic at the moment as far as conference realignment goes would be Texas and Oklahoma coming to the SEC. And that does not seem good for business on anybody's front at the moment, but that's a problem. And it's caused jobs it's probably had something to do with coaching changes at one of those two schools, and maybe both by the time it actually happens. And kids are decommitting and recommitting, and it just throws so much unknown into a situation. And for what? Like, they already had one of them has their own network on ESPN, and it's like, what do you really need out of this? Why do you think, are you doing it because you think the path to national championships is going to be easier? Because football seems to be the real reason, if I had to put one behind it. And it just seems weird to me. And now I will say that my favorite collegiate sports team has been in the same conference since that conference was founded over almost 70 years ago, I think. And so I have never had to experience this, but it just seems weird on its face unless there is a legitimate reason. And I don't think the two teams that I just spoke about really have legitimate reasons. It seems like they're just doing it for fun.
Yeah, I think Oklahoma is following Texas because it's what Texas wanted to do, and they had a way of getting out of a situation that could go bad when Texas left. Texas blows my mind because obviously it's about money, but Texas is the wealthiest athletic department in the country as it stands, and they're leaving for more money. So at some point, what's the point? But I agree with you there. And you're right. But I also pull for a school that's been in the same conference the entire time it's existed. But we're going to find out, as not to spoil anything for the episode, we're going to find out that they're not innocent in this dealings anyway. But I remember when Maryland left the ACC, I already strongly disliked Maryland in the first place. Like, I could care less if they're anywhere near me, right? But when they left, it made that hate a little bit worse. And it worked out. I'm glad that Louisville is in their place for multiple reasons. But it does suck when somebody that's been around for a while is gone. But I will say, as a kid, I thought it was great that the ACC was getting Miami and Virginia Tech and I guess Boston College up front. Then it became Syracuse and Pitt and a bigger deal. I thought that was great. And I think it's great when Notre Dame joins. That'll be awesome. Fully one day.
Whenever that happens.
Right. But it's just change, right? Sometimes change is good. Sometimes change is bad. And sometimes change is just for change's sake. And that's also bad. But it's always happened. And it's always been on some level about money and not about just other things. So let's jump into it. We're going to start our story all the way back, get in the Wayback Machine 100 years to 1921 and the founding of the Southern Conference. Now, some of you may be thinking, the Southern Conference, I know that name. To be sure, it's not the same one that plays basketball in the spring. Yes, it is. It is the exact same conference. Southern Conference is one of the oldest conferences in the country. It's not the oldest. It's going to be one of Blake's trivia questions here in a little bit.
Dang.
But it was founded in 1921, and it was founded by schools who were leaving a different conference. The Southern Intercollegiate Athletic Conference had existed since the 1800s. And it's important to remember that these early conferences just exist to create actual schedules for these teams, right? To give their teams a chance to play schools nearby for something meaningful. A championship could be put on in different sports. That's the whole reason these things exist inside of the framework of the NCAA initially. But anyway, the schools left over two things. Number one, the SIAA was going to institute a 1-year rule, which was essentially freshmen being barred from playing in all sports, something the NCAA would later do in some sports anyway. And the idea of some schools wanting to pay or have their summer baseball players playing during the summer be able to get paid. In other words, they could go on these barnstorming tours that we've talked about in some other episodes, play minor league ball for cash, because there really wasn't the opportunities that we have now in summer wood bat leagues where you can go get experience, keep playing, even though you don't get paid in those situations. The schools that were in favor of those ideas left upon those ideas being rejected, and the membership of the Southern Conference would grow to over 20 schools. And you're going to recognize where these schools are and where they went to. So the first set of schools: Alabama, Auburn, Georgia, Kentucky, Ole Miss, Mississippi State, Tennessee, Vanderbilt, Florida, LSU, Tulane, and Sewanee. We may recognize those as the SEC, minus a couple. And then the second level of schools was South Carolina, North Carolina, Duke, NC State, Virginia, Virginia Tech, Maryland, and the Virginia Military Institute. So we've got a big group of schools all over the country, really, not just in a small geographic area. That's the whole Southeast at this point. So the middle of the country all the way to the coast. How about just pausing for a second, Sewanee and VMI being in a major conference? Like, that's...
It's hard for me to remember. It's hard for me to think about a time when SoCon would have been a major conference, right? Because, and before this, I had no idea that this was the SoCon. Like the SoCon that App State won their football championships in, the SoCon that Davidson's Steph Curry led team would run to the Elite Eight in that magical March Madness run that they had. I did not realize that would have been the same thing. And so it's really, I don't know how maybe they just maybe they had a cap on like membership or something, and they just like wrapped their arms around this entire area and just pulled everybody in, you know. I feel like that's the only way to do it. But to be fair, this is the way, this is actually when regionality mattered the most, right? You don't see like the SEC that would eventually be founded is actually teams in the Southeast, unlike the two teams that we were talking about in our intro who want to join for some unknown reason. But VMI being a major school is interesting, and I don't even know where Sewanee is. I'm just going to put that out there.
Sewanee is the College of the South. You didn't know that?
Heck no.
Yeah, it is. It is. True story. So, speaking of Appalachian State, the schools that were not in the Appalachian region, so in other words, if the Appalachian Mountains didn't really touch your state, those schools all decided they wanted to leave in 1933. The conference, and maybe this has some parallels to today, the conference had gotten too big. It wasn't that you weren't playing teams regularly, so that kind of defeated the purpose. And it was just hard to travel. And so they decided 13 schools decided to split to form the Southeastern Conference to reduce size and travel. Those are the schools that you recognize as being SEC schools. Tulane is obviously in New Orleans, so they went. Interestingly enough, Georgia Tech was one of the schools that left to go form the SEC. All of those resignations, unlike in today's environment, all of those resignations were accepted graciously. Like everybody just said, yeah, you know what? This is kind of big. This is fine. Go do your own thing. Good luck in your future endeavors. Not the way we would handle that now at all.
No, not even close.
The second split from the SoCon is when the schools in the Mid-Atlantic, which include South Carolina, and I know we've got some older listeners that remember this, South Carolina being a member of this conference, but not Virginia Tech, who's a current member. All of the Mid-Atlantic schools left to form the ACC. This time it was less than gracious, though. This was motivated by, what else? The sport of football. The NCAA had just come off a couple of years of issues. One was with point shaving. We actually covered a big part of that point shaving epidemic with our CCNY episode. So go take a look at that one.
Go get it.
Take a listen to that one. There was also an academic scandal, particularly at Army, where a bunch of players were just ineligible but still playing. These happened in the 1951 season, and so the NCAA wanted to curb these problems the next year. So they were looking at what they could do to minimize some of the expectation on the athletes and the teams. The ACC, to their credit, voted to, not the ACC, the SoCon voted to not allow postseason bowl games anymore. If you win, good. You can win our conference, awesome. You are not allowed to play in bowl games. Other conferences did this as well. The Ivy League still doesn't allow participation in postseason athletics. The Ivy League champ does not play in the FCS playoffs or any other events after the regular season ends. That year, though, Clemson went ahead and went to the Gator Bowl. Maryland, who was good enough that year, went ahead and went to the Sugar Bowl and just didn't care what anybody told them. There was also an issue in the SoCon with the quality of play. They were only playing 5 conference games in football. And so that year, Maryland went 5-0, but had to share the conference title with VMI, who also went 5-0, but they didn't play the same 5 teams. Maryland played 5 teams that typically ended up at the top of the standings. VMI played 5 teams that typically ended up at the bottom of the standings. Similar situation that we have in trying to judge things in college football today. Like, you can't actually figure out who's good, but they had to share the title. Maryland wasn't a fan. To Clemson's credit, after they went to the Sugar Bowl that they weren't supposed to, the Gator Bowl that they weren't supposed to, they only played 2 conference games the next year. They just decided that they weren't going to be about it. Maryland just didn't play any. And this set up they just said, no, we're not done. We're done. We're done. We'll play other sports, but in football, we got to share a title with them. No more. And so this led to a situation where the schools that we mentioned on a geographic scale were already talking to each other, but this accelerated it. And so the school showed up to the Southern Conference meeting in 1953 with a plan to separate. Wallace Wade, former employee of the Duke University, was the current Southern Conference commissioner. Now, he was aware of some of what was going on. He was that schools were unhappy. But even though Duke is one of the schools that left to form the ACC, Wallace Wade had no idea they were going to do it at this meeting. Like, these schools showed up and said, we're out and we're done. And then Wallace Wade, in a weird situation of irony, remained as the Southern Conference commissioner, but was named the interim commissioner, the first in the ACC. So he was commissioner of both conferences for a little bit. How about that?
That might be the weirdest scenario. Like, that, of course, that would never happen today. And back then, they may not have had much of a choice. But I can't imagine that they would have. Like, why would it? I wonder if did he volunteer himself or to do both? Because that seems like a conflict of interest. You're the full-time commissioner of the conference that your former school just refused to be a part of, and you became the interim commissioner of the conference that your former school just left your full-time. It's like having a part-time and a full-time job, and
Yeah.
lots of weird conflicts of interest. So I can't imagine that either the SoCon or the ACC were fans of either of that. And I like what you said. I had the same exact thought about the Maryland going 5-0 and VMI going 5-0, but they had to split the title because all the talk this year in the SEC, of course, is how great Georgia looked. And as of like right before this recording, they got stomped in their championship game. And so they looked really, really good on paper because of their schedule and their record, because they hadn't lost, but they also didn't play anybody. And so they were getting a lot of credit that they may have not been earned, if that makes sense. But so it's interesting that problem preceded all of the analytics and stuff we have today that would allow somebody to make a more informed decision on who's actually the better team. And we still can't do it right.
Oh, yeah, we can't do that at all. Can't do that at all. I will say this. Here's the thing for the SoCon. And this was not something I knew before researching the episode. We like to think of the ACC as the king of college basketball and the innovator of the college basketball tournament for a conference. But it's not. The oldest college basketball tournament in the country belongs to the Southern Conference. It's the oldest and the most continually running. The SEC, naturally having been a part of the conference and then leaving, they have the second oldest, but they just stopped playing theirs for several years in the middle of the 1900s. So the second longest running is actually the ACC. So the Southern Conference has the oldest conference tournament. Their two offsprings have the second oldest and the second longest running. So just a fun little fact there.
Fun facts.
After the 1953 start of the ACC, which was due to schools just deciding they were done where they were, so no innocent beings in the ACC for later, there were just a few changes from that point forward. South Carolina would eventually leave the ACC. Common problem that schools have with the ACC is that there are 4 schools in North Carolina. The conference's headquarters is in North Carolina. They feel like the schools in North Carolina get favorable treatment. If you ask fans of the schools in North Carolina, they will say that the conference goes out of their way to make other people feel like they're not being treated unfairly. But nobody wants to hear that from us. So South Carolina just bolted, right? They left the SoCon because they didn't like the way things were going there. And then they left the ACC because they didn't like the way things were going there. Also, Arizona and Arizona State left the Western Athletic Conference to join the Pac-8 to make the Pac-10 in between this going on. So in the 70s as well. And that was at a time I also didn't realize that the Pac-8 and the Western Athletic Conference kind of had like a little contentious relationship about who was actually the better conference, particularly in football. BYU was in the WAC, Arizona and Arizona State were in the WAC, but the nod, benefit of the doubt, always went to the Pac-8 because they had the Rose Bowl contract, so you're not going to get by that. That's the granddaddy of them all. Also in the West was the Southwestern Conference. I know people may remember that. This is a bunch of Texas schools, as well as Arkansas, who eventually would figure out a way to become professional football for a while until the NCAA showed up in the 80s. Just paying everybody whatever they could. But it's against that backdrop that we get the most interesting round of realignment. That's in the 80s and early 90s. Now, this cycle is going to be driven by money the same way we're driven by money now, TV money. At one point in time, the NCAA actually controlled all of the TV for football. So they would collectively sell one national game per week. And 5 weeks would get a special regional package. So you would turn on your TV and the selected NCAA game of the week would be on TV, and that's it. And then 5 weeks of the season, you would also get this regional coverage window, which still happens on ABC during their coverage, like the 3:30 window is kind of a couple games and you just get the one that's closest to you. That's the way it worked. And that was it for television. The idea being that if you could watch the game on TV, you wouldn't go to the game. And at that time, gate revenue was still far exceeding television revenue. So the NCAA controlled it all. The problem is some schools didn't like this, particularly Georgia and Oklahoma, who sued on antitrust grounds that this was causing the NCAA to be a trust. The courts agreed and said that the NCAA could not do this. And then a bunch of schools went ahead and packaged their rights together again anyway in a thing called the College Football Association. And that was the same situation. They would sell their games. All the schools would get the money. The network that had the package could pick and choose what they wanted to air, but still not the situation we have now. This finally starts to change a little bit in 1991 when Notre Dame, we know them as the NBC fans, right? Notre Dame leaves the College Football Association. They signed their one school agreement for just their home games at a bigger number, and it remains to be a bigger number than what most schools can get out of their conference packages. The SEC left in 1996 to sign a deal with CBS. So it's not the last time that the SEC will use their TV deal to try and kill the status quo. Did it again this year. And that gives us the new normal. And so everybody now is looking for this TV money situation. The Big East, which you can go watch a fantastic 30 for 30 on ESPN Plus anytime you want to about the Big East basketball conference. They were a made for TV basketball conference. Perfect for this time, but they needed football. And so they were looking at creating it, right? So there's three things going on at once in the East. The Big East wants to create a football conference. Joe Paterno wants to create an East Coast all sports conference. And Raycom, a television distributor who many people in our native land know as the folks who showed us our ACC basketball and a couple of ACC football games that were important. We know them from that. Raycom was trying to get their hand in a mega conference. So first, the Big East goes ahead, and what they do, I'm going to tell you the end result is the Big East has Pitt, Syracuse, and Boston College, who are football playing members of the Big East Basketball Conference. They're independent in football, but they want to pull their resources together. So they do. And they also bring in Miami, Rutgers, Temple, West Virginia, and Virginia Tech, all who were independents. Penn State's not in that list in 1991, but they could have been, right? So now we're in the what could have happened. Joe Paterno had wanted for years an all sports East Coast conference. He kept pressuring athletic directors and coaches about it, but they never wanted to go along with it, mostly because the schools he was targeting were in the Big East for basketball, and they were making TV money from that. They don't need this other thing. So after being turned down over and over and over again, they still wanted a conference. So they turned to their current home, the Big Ten, which at the time actually had 10 teams. The presidents heard this. So the school presidents in the Big Ten heard that Penn State wanted in, and they agreed unanimously. But that's not how the Big Ten worked at the time. The actual athletic directors had to agree for an expansion. And athletic directors are former coaches at this time, and in many ways still are. And sometimes they were current coaches. Either way, because this was done a little bit in secret and they were unaware of it, and because Penn State's a name brand that you maybe don't want to compete with, Michigan football coach Bo Schembechler was very much against Penn State join, and Indiana's basketball coach Bob Knight, two legends of their sport, also wanted to vote no. They needed 7 yes votes to expand, and they've already got 2 no. In several straw polls throughout the winter, it was reported that there was a third school who would vote no. So there was a real a real threat that the Big Ten would not expand to add Penn State, that they would tell them absolutely not, go somewhere else. Everyone eventually played nice and said yes, but ACC Commissioner Gene Corrigan was caught off guard by this idea that Penn State wanted to join anything. And so he actually gave interviews as soon as it leaked that Penn State was looking to join the Big Ten, saying that he wished that he'd have known Penn State wanted to go somewhere because he would have had them in a heartbeat. There wouldn't be anybody voting no in the ACC. Just come on and join us. We'll go right now. So there's a little bit of what if. How about that? Penn State in the Big East, a different version of the Big East, or Penn State in the ACC, or Penn State just being told no by everybody. Like,
I have a hard time. I have a hard time believing that people wouldn't want such a large name in their conference, right? If all this is about money, which at this point it's about TV, which is about money, just like it is today. TV makes the football schedule, it seems, and so any sport really. But you would think that people would want Penn State in their conference. Maybe they just didn't want Joe Paterno in their conference. Like maybe the name Penn State would have been fine if not for the people that were behind the name. You know, I'm imagining an East Coast all sports conference, and that just seems like, knowing like some of the history of college conference realignment, that just seems like a terrible idea, because that seems you had conferences get too big. You just can't sustain being that large. And I don't understand why today we still think we can outsmart that principle. Like it just doesn't make sense. But out of all of those, Penn State and the ACC would have been interesting, just because we have emotional ties to that conference. I can't imagine it, but it would have been fun.
I think that would have been the most interesting what if, is them being in the ACC, because that, not all the way a geographic fit, but it would have worked. Like, it's not a stretch for them to have joined, but definitely. And I think if Penn State had really pushed for this idea before the Big East was a thing, they may have gotten their wish. And I think had it been a little bit later in the 90s, when everybody is getting their own conference TV deal, then Penn State picks their own bidder and goes wherever they want, and nobody even thinks about saying no. So it's just, they were in that in-between time, because this is the early 90s. This is when the NCAA is battling about TV revenue, and then all the schools are still packaging their deals together anyway. It just kind of meant a little bit less on the TV money side, but definitely an interesting thing. All right, are you ready for a trivia question?
Let's do it.
Okay. So I can't give you a hint to start with, because you got to ask questions. But your question is, your task is to name one of the oldest conference school affiliations. So in other words, what school has been with their conference the longest? And there's a group of them that are tied. So which school has been in their conference the longest? There's several options you can get to, but you got to tell me one.
Schools that have been in their conference the longest. Oh boy. So what about, so you're saying that there are, which schools have been a part of their conferences the longest? So it would have to be from the older conferences, right? So like
yes.
Let's see. So I need to name the schools. So what can I ask? What conferences? What is the conferences of these schools?
So
would that give it away?
No, but it's not going to be a definite good. There's a chance you get it wrong even after I tell you this thing. So let's make it spicier. I won't tell you the conference. You have to guess. You have to figure out the conference, and I'll tell you if you're right.
Okay, so I don't see that's the problem though, is knowing that the SoCon is one of the oldest. Are any of the Power Fives the oldest?
Yes.
Okay. So that can count as a question.
Yes.
So I know ACC is not it. SEC is up there somewhere, but I feel like football was being played well before 1933.
Yeah.
And so the Pac-12 shouldn't be very old, are they? I'm going to go with...
They claim some level of oldness that is not actually true because of some... It's very legalese how they claim their age, so we're not going to include... It's not the Pac-12.
Not Pac-12, not ACC, maybe the SEC, Big 12. They were all part of, you said a bunch of Texas schools were involved in a different conference, so Big 12 wouldn't be incredibly old. So would it be a member of the Big 10?
It would be a member of the Big 10.
Oh, gosh. Okay. And one of the original members of the Big 10, not necessarily what it looks like right now.
Which is key because the Big 10 dates to 1896.
Oh, they were playing football then? Oh my gosh. All right, so let me think. What would be a good way to narrow this down as far as who the older teams... can I just try and just name some teams? Does that count as questions?
That feels like you're answering the questions. I feel like that would be a finality. You'd have to get it right.
So so the first Big 10 school that comes to mind currently, I'm just going to say it. Okay. I don't know.
All right. Is this your official? Are you ready?
I don't know. I don't know that it's worth trying to narrow it down anymore. So
I'm lock it in. See what happens.
Just going to guess. I'm going to guess Michigan just because that's what. I don't know why.
I knew you were going to guess Michigan.
What?
I knew you were going to guess Michigan, and Michigan is a trick. No. Michigan is a charter member of the Big 10.
Yeah.
But they also left the Big 10 from 1907 to 1917.
What?
So,
they backed out and came back?
They were in, they were out, and then they were back in. So,
oh, man.
So, for the people at home, your options were Illinois, Minnesota, Northwestern, Purdue, Wisconsin, and that was it. The University of Chicago was also a founding member, but they are no longer a member there.
So Michigan, Michigan State, and Ohio State, none of them. See that right. Those would have been like the more well-known Big Ten schools for me, and those would have been my guesses. I don't know why I landed Michigan, but
Indiana and Iowa joined in 1899, Ohio State 1912, Michigan State 1950.
Ooh.
Penn State, we just covered, was 1990, officially began play a little bit later. And then they added Nebraska, Maryland, Rutgers from there.
R.I.P. Maryland.
Yeah. So, indeed. Oklahoma should just look at Maryland and Nebraska because that's what they're going to be in the SEC. Anyway.
Basically.
That was a little bit of editorializing. Sorry. All right. Let's jump back in here to a couple of what ifs in that 80s, 90s round of expansion. One thing that was kicked around and actually is the thing that wrote the book on super conferences, and that's quite literal. Raycom was a local TV distribution service, kind of like a syndicated TV thing. They would grab television stations in different markets. You would be a Raycom partner, and when they had a game, you would show the game on TV. They, and I mean literally wrote a book, 240-page book that they presented to several schools and commissioners. At the time, it was the Metro Conference, which would have been a non-football conference. It would have been only for the other sports. And it was for schools that were independent in football, but needed a conference for basketball and everything else. So think at the time, Florida State, Georgia Tech, South Carolina, Cincinnati. There's some really good historic programs that are in the Metro Conference. They, like the Big East, are thinking, we need football. Let's start thinking about football. And so they were presented based on the modern concept of a super conference. This is all the way back in the 90s or early 90s. So it was based on brand identity, but also market size, and looking ahead and thinking about how markets might grow and shift over time. And so here's what they came up with. They would combine 8 Metro Conference members at the time: Florida State, Louisville, South Carolina, Cincinnati, Memphis, Southern Miss, Tulane, who had made their way out of the SEC by that point, and Virginia Tech, who had not joined the Big East yet. They were a member of the Metro Conference and were independent in football, with 8 new members. The members would be football independents: Boston College, Pitt, Syracuse, Miami, Rutgers, Tulane, West Virginia. And this breaks my heart to say that they were included in one of these conversations. I know we're supposed to hate them, but I feel like they always get left out. The 16th member would have been East Carolina.
Oh, man.
Now, there's several things that go wrong at this time. Number one is that the Big East is working on their own deal. And so BC, Pitt, and Syracuse are kind of tied to that one. And obviously, Miami, Rutgers, Temple, West Virginia, and Virginia Tech, pour one out for ECU in that situation, are going to be the ones that end up founding that conference. There's also an issue where several of the coaches looked at this. Several of the athletic directors have made comment that they thought it was a great idea and they thought it would generate money. But when you really stop and think about it, somebody's going to go 0-8 and 1-7 and 2-6 in this conference. And when you get down to it, nobody wants to be that school. You go into this thinking, yeah, this is going to be a great conference. We're going to be the best conference in the world. Look at all of us. We're going to be great. But if you go 2-6, 3 or 4 seasons in a row, you're not a very good football school anymore. It doesn't take long to shift it. And so that went against them. The biggest problem is that at the same time this is going on, because everybody's looking to expand, Florida State and Miami are getting courted by the Big East, by the ACC, and by the SEC. Everybody's getting in on it, because when Penn State joined the Big Ten, the ACC said, oh no, we got to do something, and started calling Florida State and Miami. Eventually, Florida State would accept that invitation. Miami obviously would go to the Big East. And that leads me. So first of all, what's your thoughts on that 16-team mega conference?
That sounds terrible because, again, it's just like you said, you're not going to be a great football school for very long in that sort of thing. And so it is funny that East Carolina, you don't think of East Carolina as that caliber. Nothing against the school. It's a big school. I'm sure it's a fine establishment, but you don't think of it that way. And a lot of people outside of North Carolina don't even realize that East Carolina is a school. I mean, you might be able to guess because every state might have a Eastern blank or Western blank and whatever, but that just seems off. That book though, like whoever came up with that idea to like literally write a book, chef's kiss, genius.
And it's literally what everything else is based on, and whether it's intentional or not, that's how it's gone since then, right? It's been about market size. It's been about new markets. It's been less about being a good team and a good brand. Some of that's coming back, but more about the market you're in. Although we can't have any ECU slander. This is the 90s. This was the Steve Logan, Jeff Blake, like go to the Peach Bowl beat everybody.
Steve
ECU.
Logan.
So yeah, yeah, the old ball coach before the old ball coach. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, ECU was on that level for a while, and they might get back. They might get back before Texas does. We don't know.
We can only hope.
We can only hope. So the other part of this is where Florida State ends up. And so the other surprising thing that, along with people telling Penn State no, is that in this round of expansion, people in the early 90s were telling the SEC no. So as I said, the Southwestern Conference was running some sort of mafia operation during their football seasons and just throwing money around. And so eventually that conference fell apart. And so some of the schools turned into what we know as the Big 12. They joined with the Big 8 to make the Big 12. Some of those schools fell into other situations. But Arkansas actually was the first domino that fell in that situation, and they gladly joined the SEC. They, like South Carolina and the ACC, felt like the Southwestern Conference was a Texas conference, paying a lot of attention in Texas, and they loved being able to recruit in Texas, but they didn't really like playing Texas all that much. And so when the SEC, which was at 10 teams, was looking to expand by two things, because if they got to 12, nobody really realized this, but the NCAA allowed conferences of 12 teams or more to split into two divisions and have a championship game. All this TV money showing up. What's a great way to get it? A made-for-TV championship game, right? So they're looking for two schools. Arkansas was one, got them easy. Florida State and Miami were their next two targets, and they didn't get either one of them. Florida State did not want to be Florida's little brother in the situation, and so they didn't really pay him a lot of attention. Miami just liked the idea of the Big East better. Imagine that. The Big East getting a win over the SEC.
It's hard to believe today, but...
So neither one of them joined. Eventually, they would settle for South Carolina, and you can find sources out there that say that South Carolina at this time wanted to get back into the ACC, and the ACC essentially just told them to kick rocks. Like, they had their chance. We don't need you now. We don't want you.
There's a reason they're on the bottom, is all I'm saying.
Absolutely.
We love all of our listeners in the Lesser Carolina. I'm just kidding. Gosh.
I'm not. Build a wall around the whole thing except crossing the Myrtle Beach. Let's be done with it. It's okay. I mean, it's fine if you're from South Carolina, but unless you know better. So so we get the SEC. South Carolina joins, Arkansas joins. They get their championship game and then become the behemoth that we know. Big 12 gets their championship game. Everybody looks at those and wants to be the next. That spurs the ACC's expansion. The Big East falls apart, so forth and so on. That gets us to today. But I thought those two were cool. Here's one more quick story to end us up about some of these big conferences, right, that just don't work all the time. So the Western Athletic Conference that we had talked about earlier was kind of a rival, or at least a worthy opponent to the Pac-12 now. It would have been the Pac-8, then the Pac-10 out west. They had 10 original members. When the Southwestern Conference disintegrated, 4 of their schools joined the Big 8. 1 of their schools joined the SEC. The WAC looked to take the rest of them. They were originally looking to get to 12 members. They had 10 at the time to get to a title game. But the original schools, BYU, Utah, Wyoming, New Mexico, Colorado State, UTEP, San Diego State, Hawaii, and Air Force, ended up adding 6 teams. UNLV, Tulsa, San Jose State, and 3 Southwestern Conference leftovers in Rice, SMU, and TCU, to create a 16-team super conference. First one in modern history. Well, 16 teams is hard to schedule because if you split into 8-team divisions, they couldn't figure out how to do it geographically. Somebody was always getting left out. A Texas team wasn't with the Texas teams, or this team wasn't with a traditional rival. The same issues that you have splitting up any conference. So what did they do? Well, you may have heard about this in SEC land. They created 4-team pods in football, right? You'd play at that time your 3 teams in your pod every single year, so you can keep your protected rivals. And then you'd play a couple of the pods to fill out your schedule. But it quickly turned out that this limited rivalries, you only were rivals with the 3 schools you played every year, and everybody else, speaking of from North Carolina fans' existence, I know Blake is a Carolina fan. I'm sure he doesn't feel anything towards Wake Forest at all in football. I'm a State fan, and while I don't like Duke in basketball, Duke football is an afterthought to me because our schools play them one time every 6 years, I think. And it's
Not
like
often.
12 years to play them home and away. So rivalries don't exist. Conference unity is an issue. You don't see it. And so that led to problems with scheduling. In addition, while they added big markets, they didn't add the right ones. They didn't follow the book all the way because they got TCU and they got SMU, and that's Dallas and some other big markets. They're in Denver, right? They're in Las Vegas. But everywhere they were in a big market, somebody else was bigger, right? So they're in Dallas, but more people in Dallas watch Texas football than TCU football. So it wasn't like they were gaining anything. Overall, eventually BYU and Air Force, 2 of the bigger schools and bigger brands in the WAC, demanded to get divisions or they were going to be out. But the geography was weird, and so they just said, okay, we're done. And they left to form what we now know as the Mountain West. Obviously, BYU would leave, and now they're going to join the Big 12 in a couple of years. But it's the same issue, right? 16-team conference, too big, can't deal it, can't do scheduling, don't have unity, and it falls apart.
It's really hard to think that the ACC isn't bursting at the seams, right? Because right now in basketball, we have 15 teams, I believe. And it's like, it feels just like with the size, they've added a lot recently, and by recently I mean 10, 15 years, and no one's leaving. And while that may make the ACC feel good because people want to be here, it may make the original teams here feel good that other people want to join. It's kind of feels like the same issues where everyone is so spread out. Like you've got from literally Miami, Florida to Boston, Massachusetts. And that travel is tough. Even 2021, we got planes, except we don't have planes, but we have planes, and it's still a lot for college kids to go around and do that kind of stuff. And so it just seems like it's like it doesn't seem like a split is imminent, but it feels like a situation like what we've been talking about for the last 45 minutes, that we may not be as far away from that as we might think. Like we feel comfy, but in we may look comfy in the front, but in the back is bursting at the seams. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think there's some clear patterns, and if you just go through Wikipedia of your favorite conference out there and just look at the timeline of when people joined and when people didn't. Even for us, we're obviously Barton College alum. If we go and look at Conference Carolinas, a D2 conference, when people come, when people leave, how they leave, there's a lot of patterns,
Same
right?
stuff.
It's big conferences split into smaller conferences, and then they absorb more people, and then they turn into big conferences again, and something makes them split, right? Like what is old is new again. We are in a cycle where we're creating these huge conferences just based on the history of it. There's going to be a time where somebody leaves, or I got a strong feeling if you're a fan of Vanderbilt or Missouri in the SEC, you should be really reconsidering your situation, because it may not be that schools decide to leave as much as it's schools decide to kick somebody out that's not pulling their weight. a possibility that hasn't happened in history, but it definitely could. Definitely could. Wake Forest.
Yep. Shout out.
Duke.
Yeah.
Depending on the sport, right? If Duke doesn't hold their own in basketball, then they're looking at it. But I think these conferences are going to split up because it's a pattern, right? Some people are going to want to move here, move there. Somebody's going to get really good or get a bigger fan base and want to look at moving. And TV is going to change, right? It's not going to be this way. Maybe it becomes more direct to consumer. And so some of that TV money gets cut. And it's all about the package you sell to the playoff, right? And so who knows what might happen. There's also one more pattern I noticed. Texas has never been in a conference that succeeded for very long.
Got him.
I'm just saying. Texas is back, baby.
I ain't saying, I'm just saying.
I'm sure we've got listeners in Texas, and this is just all in good fun, okay? We also have a friend that really loves Texas, and it's also in good fun, but,
we say this stuff to him every day, and it's fine. I will say one final thought, though. I'm surprised at so recently, like within our lifetimes, there were a lot of independent football teams.
Yeah.
Like way more than I realized, because being a fan of a school in the ACC for everything, we see Notre Dame as like this weird, like get in or get out, like pull your weight or leave kind of deal, and in football in particular. And it wasn't that long ago that there were a lot of schools that did not have conferences. It's like they didn't have homes. And that's kind of how it feels, right? Is like if a team's not a part of a conference, they're just like, what are you doing? Why aren't you a part of a conference? There's all these benefits to being in one. Why aren't you in one? Like, what's wrong with you? But that's not necessarily the case. That's just kind of how it feels. But that's interesting. It's like how recent in history all these teams were just like out there floating and not part of, not competing for like, what were they competing for? If they weren't competing in a conference for a conference title, like they're just playing games.
Yeah, that was when bowl games were king, and there weren't all the tie-ins. Some of the conferences had tie-ins, but everybody didn't. So there were the big bowls you could get in with by being independent, and so that's
crazy.
That's what they were looking for. But yeah, it is in today's lens incredible that so many of them existed. All right, well, that's it for today. If you've got an idea, got a story you want to hear us tell, make sure to let us know. But that's what you don't know about conference realignment. See y'all next time.
Bye.